I'm with the DC think tank, the Atlanta Council, and that's really what we do, is we're there to help the national security people understand cyber and understand the cyber people, the cyber folks understand the national security side. I came out of this as a signals intelligence guy and then ran certs in the White House, so we're trying to put ourselves in that position. And since I've only got 5 minutes, I want to jump right into something that hasn't come up a lot. When we look at national security and cyber, I think we've been too mystified on cyber and thinking about it differently. So we just came out with our military history of cyberspace called A Fierce Domain that really looks at cyber conflict as if it's any other kind of conflict. So cyber conflict, we don't mean the regular hacking stuff, not the normal computer crime, but really how nation states have actually been fighting in cyberspace for the last 25 years. So this is espionage, patriotic hackers, as well as the more nation-to-nation stuff, like Russia versus Estonia, Russia versus Georgia, US and Iran going back and forth. And I'll just mention a few of the lessons. First, that there is a history and we've largely been ignoring it. So I came out of the Air Force, and you could take a fighter pilot from 1916 and a fighter pilot today, and you give them a couple of beers, and within 5 minutes, they're going to be talking about these awesome dogfights that they were having. Threw on the brakes, the other guy flew right by. Because the underlying dynamics of dogfighting, of fighting in the air, hasn't changed in 100 years. Even though the technology has gotten more lethal, the speed's faster, they're operating at altitudes and over ranges that were previously unable to think about. We find the same thing is true about cyber conflict. You could take someone from the earliest cyber espionage that we were finding, the early cyber conflicts of 1986, and you could put them into a cyber espionage case today, and they're going to get what's going on. So when you hear people that say, and you're going to hear this again and again from experts, that the only constant is change, that this cyber stuff is always changing, and if you're out of it for a little bit, you'll come back in and it's going to be different. It's not fun. It's true at the technical level, but it's not true at the level of the dynamics of what's actually happening. You go back and you look at some of these quotes from the earliest days. One of my favorite quotes, you're going to hear this again and again during this conference, that someone that said, there are no contemporaneous security controls that can keep a dedicated red team from easily accessing any information sought. That the red team's always going to get through, very common for people to say at conferences like that. That dates back to 1979. So I think we've forgotten this history. We've been ignoring it, certainly in Washington, D.C. I think if we'd remembered that red teams have been able to get through since 1979, we would be handling the solutions differently. We would stop doing more of the same. The other big lesson that we came out of this, first lesson, there is a history. We've largely been ignoring it. We've had 7 different things that were called wake-up calls by secretaries of defenses or presidents or the generals that were involved. So we have a wake-up call, only to have another wake-up call a few years later when that generation of leaders has moved on. The second major lesson, and one that I think directly contradicts what passes for wisdom about national security cyber, certainly in Washington, D.C., is that the more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is to conflict in the air, land, and sea. I'll say that again. The more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is to conflict in the air, land, and sea. So what do we mean by that? You'll hear a lot of people, especially out of Cyber Command and other places, and they'll talk about network speed, about how this is all so fast, and the difficulty of attribution, and problems with deterrence, and all of these things that are really de rigueur in Washington, D.C., especially with the Cyber Command people. You'll hear network speed a lot with them. And you know, it's true, but it also doesn't really matter as much as we make it out. Because if you take conflict in the air, land, and sea, tactical engagements can be over like that, right? A dogfight. You could be shot down before you even know you're in a dogfight. But warfare in the air it's never decided by one or two dogfights. It's days, weeks, months, years of back and forth between adversaries. You can't just bomb the other guy's runway, you gotta keep re-hitting it. And we find when you look at cyber conflict, like any other national security conflict, the same thing is true. Yes, attacks can happen at network speed, as fast as the guy can push the enter key, but who cares at the national security level? Because the battles aren't cyber conflicts aren't generally decided by one push of the enter key. Look at Stuxnet, look at Estonia, look at so many of these cases are this back and forth from one side to the other over weeks, months, and years. So when you hear generals in Washington, D.C. say, I need more authority, I need looser rules of engagement, because I'm not going to have time to go to the president to get his authority. You're taking what's true at the tactical level from people fighting in the foxholes, and you're then putting that up to the level of strategic conflict in ways that we find are not matched when you study the actual cases of how nations have fought. Similarly, attribution for the most significant cases also tends not to be very important. Attribution tends to build up from the most technical level, IP addresses, the computers involved, and then they try and make a story about who might be responsible. I'll tell you, if you're in the White House, if you're in Washington, D.C., you don't care what computers the attackers were from. Look at Estonia, 2007, Russian attackers against Estonia. The people that were focused on attribution would tell you those attacks came from something like 178 different countries. And that's a tactical, technical fact. But from a national security perspective, who cares? If you're the president of the United States, you care about two countries. Some of these attacks are coming from the United States, and we have to make those stop. But if you really want the attacks to stop, you ignore every other country. You pick up the phone and you call Mr. Putin. Because Russia is behind these. And if you want to solve this, you don't solve it through cyber means, you solve it by putting pressure on the Kremlin. And as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, putting pressure on the Kremlin doesn't always work. But it's certainly more likely to work than the technical fixes that we've been pursuing. So to wrap up, there is a history. The lessons that you learn from that are very different from the lessons that we've actually been following for the last 15 years. And I think we're going to continue to suffer these additional wake-up calls until we really start paying attention to what's been happening at the level between nations, as well as the level of what's happening at the networks. There's other lessons on deterrence, on the likelihood of disruptive attacks, but we can get that if you're interested in the Q&A. Howdy.
So do you think that cyber problems between the U.S., China, Russia, et cetera, can be solved entirely through diplomacy, standard diplomatic channels?
I think it's going to have a lot better chance of working than the stuff that we've been doing for the last 20 years, which is classifying it and looking at technical solutions. When we're looking at the history of from 2007 on, we were starting to get ourselves, or we have been in a very dangerous spot, where there's an accepted norm, where a norm that's becoming more accepted, that as long as countries stay below the level of warfare, it's okay to punch each other under the table. Really started with Georgia and Estonia, but really Russia and Estonia, but you can see it now with Stuxnet and the DDoSes on the banks. 2013 has been an amazing year for agreements between heads of state and between countries. Putin and Obama have signed agreements on confidence-building measures. Obviously, President Obama bringing up pressure on Xi Jinping, which I think has a very good chance of leading to something helpful. The UN Group of Government Experts has, the UN Secretary General sent a group of not notionally independent national experts, but really mostly taking guidance from their countries. And they agreed on a lot of important things. That, like, for example, existing international law applies to cyberspace. The Chinese had never come forward and agreed that, for example, the Geneva Convention applies to cyberspace. Now that's more and more on the table. So really, 2013 could be the year, a real watershed year, where you're starting to see nations agree to norms about, at least on the warfare level, about how you behave. So there are good reasons why I think diplomacy could work. Hey.
Are there also reasons that the U.S. wouldn't want to push too hard on diplomacy because we're quite effective?
Yeah. So the question was, are the reasons the U.S. might not want to push back on diplomacy because we're so effective? I no longer fully believe that the United States government acts as if we want peace and security in cyberspace. We don't act that way anymore. If you read it, President Obama can come out and he can say, we believe these things about the world, and the United States has these values, but the world is still a dangerous place, and therefore we're going to use drones and special operations to kill the bad people. What we've never been able to do for cyberspace, because it was so highly classified by exactly these people that have the most to gain, it's been so highly classified that the US cyber strategies talk about wonderful peace in cyberspace and how we want a secure, peaceful, free internet. But we haven't then gone and said, but they're still bad people, so we are going to do espionage and we're going to do cyber attacks. And unfortunately right now in Washington, D.C., the people that are out doing the cyber espionage and the attacks are really, I think, defining the US agenda much more than those in State Department Commerce and in other places that are working for peace and freedom and security. So the US government wants both. Right now, I think we're getting pretty far ahead on the side that's doing the espionage and the attack.